The moving truck pulled up to the two-story house with blue shutters just as the morning sun lit up the quiet street. Andrew wiped sweat from his forehead and smiled at his wife Tanya, who was checking items off her clipboard. After years of saving every penny, working overtime, and dreaming of this moment, they were finally here, homeowners in Cedar Heights. "Can you believe it?" Tanya whispered, squeezing Andrew's hand. Her eyes shined with pride as she looked at their new home. The front yard needed some work, but the maple tree would give perfect shade in the summer. The porch swing they'd picked out would fit perfectly. Andrew kissed her cheek. "We earned this, every single brick." And they had. Andrew had worked his way up from entry level to becoming one of the top attorneys at his firm, often staying late preparing cases and mentoring younger lawyers. Tanya's journey had been even more impressive. Starting as a medical resident working brutal shifts, she now held the prestigious position of chief of surgery at Memorial Hospital. Her steady hands had saved countless lives. "Mom, Dad, which room is mine?" Their 12-year-old son Jordan called from the driveway, already pulling his basketball and gaming console from the car. "Second floor, first door on the right." Andrew called back, chuckling as the boy raced inside, full of energy. The movers began carrying furniture and boxes into the house. Tanya directed traffic, making sure everything went to the right rooms. Their daughter Zoe, 16 and pretending to be too cool for the family excitement, secretly took photos of every room to send to her friends. "It's actually pretty nice," she admitted reluctantly when Tanya caught her smiling at the bay window in what would be her bedroom. By noon, neighbors began to stop by. An elderly couple brought homemade cookies. A woman with twin toddlers dropped off a potted plant. A young couple around their age invited them to the neighborhood barbecue the following weekend. "Everyone seems so friendly," Tanya said as they broke for lunch, sitting on moving boxes in their half-furnished kitchen. Andrew nodded, taking a bite of his sandwich. "This is going to be good for us. The kids have better schools, we're closer to the hospital for your on-call nights, and I can actually get home at a decent hour." What they didn't notice was the man across the street, watching from behind partially closed blinds. Harold Martin had lived in Cedar Heights for over 20 years. He frowned as he observed the new family through his window, phone in hand as he took notes. By evening, the moving truck was gone, and the family sat exhausted but happy on their new patio furniture. The sunset painted the sky in beautiful oranges and pinks as they ate pizza straight from the box. "To new beginnings," Andrew said, raising his soda can in a toast. "To our forever home," Tanya added. Jordan raised his can too high and almost spilled it, making everyone laugh. Even Zoe joined in, her teenaging difference momentarily forgotten in the warmth of family celebration. Inside the house, the walls echoed with the sounds of laughter and chatter as they unpacked essentials for their first night. Tanya hung family photos along the staircase, their wedding day, Jordan's first basketball game, Zoe's dance recital, vacations at the beach. Each picture was a piece of their journey. "Remember that trip?" Andrew asked, pointing to a photo of them in front of the Grand Canyon. "You were pregnant with Jordan and insisted we hike anyway." Tanya laughed. The ranger thought I was crazy. As night fell, they settled into their new rooms. The house creaked and settled around them, unfamiliar sounds they would soon learn to recognize as the heartbeat of their home. What they couldn't know as they drifted off to sleep that first night was that not everyone in Cedar Heights was happy about their arrival. And across the street, Harold was already making a phone call, his voice low but urgent as he spoke about the new people who had moved in. The dream home they had worked so hard for was about to become the center of an unexpected storm. Harold Martin prided himself on knowing everything that happened on Maple Avenue. From behind his living room curtains, he kept track of who visited whom, which lawns needed mowing, and who put their trash out too early. His neighbors called him dedicated to the community to his face. Behind his back, they used different words. It had been 3 days since the new family moved in across the street, and Harold hadn't liked a single thing he'd seen. The husband, that Andrew fellow, wore suits that looked too expensive. The wife drove a car that Harold thought was showing off. Even the kids seemed too comfortable in a neighborhood where homes cost what they did. "They don't fit in here," he muttered to his cat as he watched Andrew get the mail. "Something's not right." Harold's suspicions grew when he spotted Andra in the backyard with a measuring tape and notebook. The man was walking the property line, stopping every few feet to write something down. Planning something without permission, Harold said, reaching for his phone to take pictures. The neighborhood association have strict rules about property modifications. Harold had helped write most of those rules himself. That evening, Harold noticed several cars parked in front of the new family's house. He wrote down each license plate number, grumbling about these people inviting crowds over already. When he recognized Dr. Wilson's car, the head of Cedar Heights Hospital Board, Harold was confused. What business would someone like that have with the new family? The next morning, Harold decided to check his mail at the exact time Tanya was leaving for work. He timed it perfectly, stepping onto his porch just as she locked her front door. "Good morning," she called out with a friendly wave. Harold nodded stiffly. "You've been quite busy over there." Tanya smiled. "Just getting settled. I'm Tanya, by the way. My husband Andra and our kids Jordan and Zoe moved in last week." "I know," Harold said. "I've lived here 20 years. Keep an eye on things." "Well, it's nice to have watchful neighbors," Tanya said, though her smile faltered slightly. "Actually, since I have you here, we're thinking of putting up a fence in the backyard. Any idea who we should talk to about neighborhood guidelines?" Harold's suspicion deepened. A fence. There are very specific rules about that. Height restrictions, material requirements. The association board reviews all plans. Perfect. Andrew was hoping to submit drawings next week. He's measuring everything to make sure we do it right. This wasn't the response Harold expected. He'd been certain they were trying to bypass the rules. "I'm the board secretary," he said. "I'll be reviewing your application personally." "Wonderful. We'll make sure everything's in order." "I better run. Surgery scheduled at 8. Tanya hurried to her car, looking forward to being neighbors. As her car pulled away, Harold stood frowning. Surgery? She must be a nurse, he thought, refusing to believe she could be a surgeon. That night, Harold started a group text with 4 other neighborhood association members. New family on Maple seems suspicious. Husband measuring for unauthorized fence. Lots of visitors. Expensive cars. We should watch closely. When Friday came, Harold spotted a delivery truck dropping off lumber in the Johnsons' driveway. He immediately took photos with his phone, though he couldn't see anything obviously wrong. Later that afternoon, he noticed Andrew's car wasn't in the driveway, but several other vehicles had arrived. He recognized one as belonging to the city councilman. What are they up to? He wondered, growing increasingly agitated. By Sunday morning, Harold couldn't contain himself. He saw Andrew in the backyard again, this time showing papers to a man in work clothes. Harold put on his neighborhood association badge, the one he'd had custom-made at the trophy shop, and marched across the street. "Excuse me," he called out as he opened their side gate without knocking. "I need to talk to you about code violations." What Harold didn't know was that the man standing with Andrew was the head of the city's building department, reviewing the properly filed permits. And he had no idea that his years of self-appointed neighborhood surveillance were about to blow up in his face. The backyard fell silent as Harold stomped across the freshly cut grass, his neighborhood association badge gleaming in the sunlight. Andrew straightened his posture, taking a deep breath before turning to face the man who'd been watching their every move since they arrived. "Can I help you?" Andrew asked, his voice calm despite the intrusion. "This is Tom Wilson," Andrew continued, gesturing to the man beside him. "He's the head of the city's building department. We were just going over the permit applications for our fence." Harold's steps faltered, but he quickly recovered. "I'm Harold Martin, secretary of the Cedar Heights Neighborhood Association. Any modifications require our approval before city permits." Tom, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and 30 years of experience dealing with neighborhood disputes, smiled politely. "Actually, Mr. Martin, city code supersedes neighborhood guidelines. But don't worry. Andrew here has done his homework. He's already submitted all the proper documentation to your association. I checked the records myself." Harold's face reddened. "I haven't seen any paperwork." "I dropped it off Wednesday with Mrs. Chen, the association president," Andrew explained. She signed the receipt. Before Harold could respond, the sliding glass door opened, and Tanya stepped out carrying a tray of lemonade. "I thought you all might be thirsty. It's getting warm out here." She placed the tray on the patio table. "Would you like to join us, Mr. Martin? We're just finalizing plans for the fence." Harold stood awkwardly, caught between his suspicions and Tanya's hospitality. "No, thank you. I just wanted to make sure everything was being done properly." "Of course," Tanya said. "We want to be good neighbors. Actually, we're having a small gathering tonight to meet everyone on the block. Nothing fancy, just some food and conversation. We'd love for you to come." "A party?" Harold's eyes narrowed. "There are noise ordinances in this neighborhood." Tom took a glass of lemonade. "I was just telling Andra how my wife and I hosted our block party here last summer. Remember that, Harold? You called the city to complain about the music, but it was well within the allowed decibel range." Harold shifted uncomfortably. "I'll see about tonight," he muttered before turning to leave. As the sun began to set, the Johnsons' backyard transformed. String lights hung between trees, creating a warm glow over the gathering. The smell of barbecue filled the air as Andra manned the grill. Zoe had reluctantly agreed to watch Jordan and the other neighborhood kids in the front yard, where they played basketball and tag. Neighbors arrived in twos and threes, bringing side dishes and curious smiles. Tanya welcomed each one, introducing herself as a surgeon at Memorial Hospital. Many were surprised. Harold had been spreading rumors that they might be lottery winners or involved in something questionable. "Your husband's a lawyer, right?" asked Mrs. Chen, the elderly association president. "My grandson is thinking about law school." "Yes, corporate law," Tanya explained. Andra would be happy to talk with him about it. By 8 o'clock, the party was in full swing. Soft jazz played from speakers while conversations flowed easily among neighbors. Dr. Wilson, the hospital board director, chatted with Andra about joining the neighborhood golf league. The high school principal discussed academic programs with Tanya for Zoe's upcoming year. From his window across the street, Harold watched the gathering with growing irritation. He counted 15 cars parked along the street. He took photos of people entering the Johnsons' yard. When the music reached his ears, though it was barely loud enough to hear from his porch, he'd had enough. Harold marched across the street for the second time that day. He pushed through the side gate without knocking, his face tight with anger. The laughter and conversation around the patio died down as neighbors noticed his arrival. "This is a violation of the noise ordinance," Harold announced loudly. "It's after 8 on a weeknight." Andra stepped forward, still holding barbecue tongs. "Hello, Harold. Glad you could make it after all. Would you like a plate?" "Don't patronize me," Harold snapped. "This gathering is disturbing the peace." Mrs. Chen stood up from her seat. "Harold, I'm sitting right here and can barely hear the music. What's really bothering you?" The guests watched uncomfortably as Harold's face grew darker. "These people don't understand how things work in Cedar Heights. They think they can just move in and change everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Tanya stepped forward, her expression calm but determined. "Mr. Martin, what exactly do you mean by these people?" Harold stood frozen as every eye in the backyard turned toward him. Tanya's question hung in the air. What did he mean by these people? I mean people who don't respect our community standards," he stammered, his face growing redder by the second. Mrs. Chen shook her head slightly. "Seems to me they're bringing the neighborhood together better than our last 3 association barbecues." Uncomfortable laughter rippled through the crowd. Harold looked around, recognizing faces of neighbors who had always sided with him before. Now they were holding plates of food, smiling at his discomfort. "This music is too loud," Harold insisted, grasping for something concrete. "And there are too many cars. It's against regulations." Dr. Wilson checked his watch. "It's 8:15 on a Saturday, Harold. Noise ordinances don't kick in until 10 o'clock. You know that." "I'll be watching," Harold said, pointing his finger at Andra. "This isn't over." He turned and marched back across the street, the sound of resumed conversation following him. Once inside his house, Harold paced his living room, his cat watching from the couch. The party continued across the street, but now it seemed louder to him. Every laugh an insult, every car door a violation. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the non-emergency police number. Then he hesitated. Would they even respond to a noise complaint before 10 p.m.? Probably not. He needed something stronger. Harold dialed 911. Emergency services, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. There's a large disturbance across from my house, Harold said, making his voice sound frightened. A lot of people very rowdy. I don't feel safe. What's the address, sir? 1842 Maple Avenue. The new people who moved in are hosting some kind of gathering. There are strange cars all over the street, blocking access. What if an ambulance needed to get through? Are they being violent, sir? Harold looked out his window. He could see Andra flipping burgers while an older couple chatted with him. Children played a quiet game of cards on a picnic blanket. They're intimidating. There's drinking, and they definitely don't belong in this neighborhood. Sir, we'll send an officer to check, but I need to inform you that misuse of emergency services is a serious offense. Just send someone, Harold snapped before hanging up. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up in front of the Johnsons' house. The blue lights cast eerie shadows across the yards. The officer, a stocky man named Officer Lee, approached the gathering cautiously, his hand resting on his belt. Conversations died as people noticed the police presence. Jordan and Zoe froze in the middle of their card game. Tanya and Andra exchanged a look before Andra stepped forward. Good evening, officer. Can I help you? Andra asked, placing his drink down slowly. We received a complaint about a disturbance, Officer Lee said, scanning the crowd. His posture relaxed slightly when he recognized Dr. Wilson and Mrs. Chen. A disturbance? Andrew repeated, keeping his voice level despite the humiliation washing over him. We're just having a small housewarming. We informed all our neighbors. Officer Lee nodded. Mind if I take a look around? Not at all, Andrew said, though everyone could feel the tension in the air. As Officer Lee walked through the gathering, he saw the hospital board director, 2 school teachers, a judge, and several other prominent community members. The music was barely audible, and most people were simply eating and talking quietly. I think I understand the situation, Officer Lee said, returning to Andra. There's clearly no disturbance here. From across the street, Harold watched through his curtains as the officer spoke with Andra for several minutes. Instead of breaking up the party, Officer Lee accepted a bottle of water and chatted with some guests. Harold's anger boiled over. He grabbed his phone again, this time dialing a different number. Captain Brooks, this is Harold Martin from Cedar Heights. I need to talk to you about one of your officers who refused to handle a situation properly. What Harold didn't know was that Captain Brooks had just left the Johnsons' party early to start his shift, and the caller ID on the captain's phone was already telling him everything he needed to know about who was really causing problems in Cedar Heights. Captain Brooks looked at his phone and sighed. Mr. Martin, I was just at that gathering you're calling about. There was silence on the other end of the line. In fact, the captain continued, Dr. Johnson performed surgery on my mother last month. Saved her life when 3 other doctors said it couldn't be done. Harold's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Doctor? She's a real doctor. Chief of surgery at Memorial, one of the best in the state. The captain's voice hardened. And her husband is a founding partner at Wilson and Garcia Law. They're exactly the kind of people we want in Cedar Heights. But they? I thought. Harold stuttered. I know what you thought, Mr. Martin, and we'll be having a conversation about your misuse of emergency services tomorrow. Good night. Across the street, the party continued, though with a subdued tone after the police visit. Andra pulled Tanya aside near the kitchen. You okay? He asked, his hand gently touching her shoulder. Tanya nodded, though her eyes were tired. We've been through worse. Remember that country club in Phoenix? They shared a sad smile at the memory. 20 years together had given them plenty of practice handling these situations. Mom, Dad, Zoe called from the living room. Everyone's asking what happened. They returned to find their guests gathered in concerned clusters. Mrs. Chen approached immediately. That was Harold's doing, wasn't it? She asked, her voice tight with anger. That man has been a thorn in everyone's side for years. Dr. Wilson joined them. Tanya, I had no idea you were dealing with this. Why didn't you say something at the hospital? Tanya shrugged. It's not exactly something you bring up during surgical rounds. Well, it stops now, said a tall woman with short gray hair who'd been quietly sitting in the corner. I'm Judge Rosario. I've lived next door to Harold for 8 years, and he's complained about everything from my bird feeder to my holiday decorations. One by one, neighbors shared their own stories of Harold's community standards crusade. The school principal had endured complaints about his teenage son's car being too loud. The retired couple in the corner had been reported for having too many potted plants on their porch. He's an equal opportunity complainer, laughed Officer Lee, who had stayed at the party. But this time he crossed a line. Filing a false police report is serious. As people began to leave, many stopped to reassure Andrew and Tanya that they were welcome in Cedar Heights. Handshakes turned to hugs. Phone numbers were exchanged. What Harold had intended as humiliation had transformed into community support. Later that night, after cleaning up and putting the kids to bed, Andrew and Tanya sat on their new porch swing. What do you think will happen now? Andrew asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. With Harold? Hard to say. People like that don't change easily. They sat in comfortable silence, looking up at the stars. Their phones buzzed almost simultaneously. Both had received the same text message from an unknown number. This is Harold Martin. I wish to formally apologize for my behavior. The police captain has explained the seriousness of my actions. I now understand that I was mistaken about your family. Andrew raised an eyebrow. Sounds like someone got scared straight. Not an apology for the right reasons, Tanya observed. But it's a start, Andrew replied. Their conversation was interrupted by headlights as a car pulled into their driveway. Captain Brooks stepped out, his face grim in the porch light. Sorry to disturb you folks so late, he said, climbing the steps to join them. But there's something you should know about Harold Martin. What is it? Tanya asked, sitting up straight. He just had what appears to be a heart attack. Ambulance is taking him to Memorial now. The captain looked directly at Tanya. And you're the cardiac surgeon on call tonight. Andrew squeezed Tanya's hand as they shared a look that communicated years of unspoken understanding. I'll get my things, she said quietly, standing up. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony after all. Morning light streamed through the windows of Cedar Heights as word spread about Harold's heart attack. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, talking in hushed tones. By noon, everyone knew that Dr. Tanya Johnson, the very woman Harold had tried to humiliate, had performed emergency surgery to save his life. At the hospital, Tanya checked Harold's vitals for the 3rd time that morning. The surgery had been complicated, requiring all her skill and focus. When Harold's eyes finally fluttered open, confusion crossed his face. Where am I? He asked, his voice raspy. Memorial Hospital, Tanya replied calmly. You had a heart attack last night. I performed your surgery. Harold stared at her, recognition slowly dawning. You're the neighbor. I'm also the chief of surgery, Tanya said, making notes on his chart. The blockage in your left anterior descending artery was severe. We placed 2 stents. You'll need several weeks of recovery and cardiac rehabilitation. Harold looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Why would you help me? Tanya's hands paused over the chart. Because that's my job, Mr. Martin. In my operating room, everyone receives the same care. A knock at the door interrupted them. A nurse poked her head in. Dr. Johnson, the news crew is here for that interview about the new cardiac wing. Thank you, I'll be right there. Tanya turned back to Harold. Rest now. Dr. Patel will check on you this afternoon. As she walked away, Harold called out weakly, Wait, thank you. Tanya nodded once before closing the door behind her. Meanwhile, back in Cedar Heights, Hander opened the front door to find Mrs. Chen and 5 other neighbors standing on his porch with baskets of food and flowers. We wanted to check on you, Mrs. Chen explained, and to let you know that we've called an emergency meeting of the Neighborhood Association for tomorrow evening. Ander invited them in, and Jordan helped serve coffee while Zoe reluctantly put her phone down to join the adults. What's the meeting about? Ander asked. Harold, of course, said Mr. Patel, a retired professor who lived at the end of the block. His behavior has gone too far this time. We're voting on new anti-discrimination guidelines for the association. And a new secretary, added Mrs. Chen with a small smile. I've put your name forward if you're interested. Andrew was surprised. Me? I've only lived here a few weeks. Sometimes fresh eyes are exactly what we need, Mr. Patel said. Besides, your legal expertise would be valuable. As they talked, a news van pulled up in front of the house. A reporter and cameraman approached the door. Mr. Johnson, the reporter called. We'd like to talk to you about the incident at your home last night and your wife's role in saving Mr. Martin's life. The neighbors exchanged looks. Mrs. Chen stood up. I believe I can help with that. I witnessed everything. By evening, the story had made the local news. The headline read, Surgeon saves life of man who called police on her family. Photos showed Tanya in her white coat alongside Andrew in his suit. The reporter interviewed neighbors who praised the Johnsons and criticized Harold's actions. At the hospital, Harold watched the broadcast from his bed, his face growing paler with each minute. His phone had been silent all day, no visitors, no calls from neighbors who had once supported his community standards crusade. When the door opened, he expected another nurse but instead saw Captain Brooks. Feeling better? The captain asked, taking a seat beside the bed. Harold nodded weakly. Good, because once you're recovered, we need to discuss the false police report you filed. The captain's voice was professional but firm. There are consequences for misusing emergency services, Mr. Martin. I understand, Harold whispered. Do you? The captain leaned forward. Because from where I stand, you've been getting away with harassment for years. People were afraid to challenge you, but that ends now. As the captain left, Harold turned back to the window. Outside, he could see the hospital parking lot where Tanya was giving an interview, surrounded by admiring staff members. The reporter handed her a microphone, and though Harold couldn't hear the words, he saw her smile, confident, professional, belonging. For the first time in 20 years, Harold Martin wondered if he was the one who didn't belong in Cedar Heights after all. 3 months passed since that night when blue police lights had flashed across the Johnson family's new lawn. Cedar Heights had settled back into its peaceful rhythm, but things were different now. The maple trees along the street had begun changing colors, painting the neighborhood in warm oranges and reds. Andrew stood in his front yard, raking leaves while Jordan jumped into the piles, scattering his work. Across the street, Harold's house sat quieter than before. Look who's coming home, Tanya said, stepping out onto the porch with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. A car pulled up in front of Harold's house. The driver helped Harold from the passenger seat and handed him a walker. Cardiac rehab had been difficult. Harold had lost weight, and his once rigid posture now curved slightly, as if the weight of his actions had physically pressed down on his shoulders. Should we go say hello? Andrew asked, taking a mug from his wife. Tanya nodded. They crossed the street together, leaving Jordan to continue destroying the leaf piles. Welcome home, Mr. Martin, Tanya called as they approached. Harold looked up, surprise crossing his face. Thank you, he said softly. The driver, a young healthcare worker, smiled. Dr. Johnson, I didn't know you lived here too. Right across the street, Tanya confirmed, Mr. Martin is our neighbor. Harold cleared his throat. Would you like to come in for a minute? Inside, Harold's house was meticulously organized but felt empty somehow. Photos of a woman who must have been his late wife sat on the mantel. A single cat wandered in to investigate the visitors. How are you feeling? Tanya asked as they settled in the living room. Better, Harold replied. Thanks to you. He paused, struggling for words. I've had a lot of time to think in the hospital and rehab center. Andrew nodded encouragingly. I was wrong, Harold said finally. About you. About a lot of things. He gestured to a stack of papers on the coffee table. I've resigned from the neighborhood association. Mrs. Chen has all my files. That wasn't necessary, Andrew said. Everyone deserves a second chance. Harold shook his head. It was time. 20 years is long enough. He looked down at his hands. My wife, Eleanor, she was the one who loved this community. After she died 10 years ago, I think I just held on too tight to things staying the same. Understanding passed between them as Harold continued. The association is in good hands with you as secretary now, Mr. Johnson. And please, he corrected gently. A knock at the door interrupted them. The healthcare worker answered it to find Mrs. Chen and several other neighbors standing outside with food and welcome home cards. "We heard you were coming home today," Mrs. Chen explained as they filed in. Everyone brought something. Harold's eyes widened at the unexpected kindness. After everything that happened, community means forgiving and moving forward, Mrs. Chen said firmly. Besides, you'll need help during your recovery. As the neighbors filled Harold's quiet house with chatter and food, Tanya pulled Andra aside. "I need to head to the hospital for my shift. Will you be okay here?" Andra kissed her cheek. "We'll be fine. I think this is good for everyone." 2 weeks later, the Johnsons' doorbell rang early on a Saturday morning. Zoe answered it to find Harold standing there, steadier on his feet now, holding a small plant in a ceramic pot. "Is your dad home?" he asked. Andra appeared behind his daughter. "Morning, Harold. What brings you by?" "I remembered you mentioned wanting to plant a garden next spring," Harold said, holding out the pot. "This is Black-Eyed Susan. Elena always said they're impossible to kill. Thought it might be a good start." Andra accepted the gift with a smile. "Would you like to come in for breakfast? Tanya's making her famous pancakes." Harold hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." By the time the next summer arrived, Cedar Heights had transformed in subtle but important ways. The new fence in the Johnsons' backyard had been built with help from Harold, who knew more about proper construction than anyone else on the block. The neighborhood association had adopted formal anti-discrimination policies, with Andra's legal expertise ensuring they were properly written and enforceable. Most surprisingly, Harold had become Jordan's unofficial grandfather figure, teaching the boy chess and telling stories about Cedar Heights' early days. The bitter man who had once watched from behind curtains now sat on his front porch, waving to neighbors and offering gardening advice. On the anniversary of their move-in date, the Johnsons hosted another backyard gathering. This time, Harold helped set up the tables and string the lights. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, Andra raised his glass in a toast. "To Cedar Heights," he said, "where people can change and communities can grow." Across the yard, Harold caught Tanya's eye and nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Some lessons came at a heavy price, but the most important ones usually did.